everybody. My name's Caroline Douglas and I'm the Director of the Contemporary Art Society. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this session today. This is the third session in our new CPD programme entitled Doing the Work, Embedding Anti-Racism and Decolonization in Museum Practice. It is a series of practice-focused workshops devised by the Contemporary Arts Society and the Decolonizing Arts Institute at the University of the Arts, London. There are 8 workshops in the series, each of which focuses on a different area of museum work. The purpose of the workshops is to provide a space for people working in and with museums to talk openly about their experiences of trying to embed anti-racism and decolonization into their work, the challenges they're facing, and to work together to come up with workable strategies that everyone can test back in the workplace. The sessions have been designed so that everyone attending will participate actively in an intimate setting and support each other to develop new and more effective ways of doing this work. It has to be acknowledged that as an organisation, as a charity, the Contemporary Art Society is overwhelmingly white, in that we differ little from so many organisations in the UK. So we approach the Do the Work programme this year in the spirit of learning alongside of our museum colleagues, learning together. Because if we don't learn how to be part of the solution, we will always be part of the problem. Because of the pandemic and the closure of so many of our museums, we seem to have arrived at an inflection point, a moment that seems ripe for reinventing the way that we do things. A return to normal when the health crisis is over would be a return to inequality. And what we have now seems to be a chance to grasp and embed change. I'm very grateful to Angeli Delal-Clayton and my colleague Ilaria Periperini for working so hard with all of you on developing this series. It's very much co-generated content, I feel, as we work towards change together. I'm now going to hand over to my colleagues to introduce the speakers, and I look forward to the next couple of hours very much. Thank you again for participating.
Thank you, Caroline. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third workshop in the Doing the Work series, which, as Caroline said, is focusing on documenting collections and how we can embed anti-racism and decolonization into collections documentation and cataloguing practices. I'm Kathleen Lawther, a freelance curator and collections consultant, and I'm delighted to be here today to hear from 2 incredible presenters about their work and to discuss this really important topic with all of you. So I know at some point today we'll be talking about our motivations in doing this work and where we're coming from. So I think it's useful for me to explain how I, as a white British woman museum worker, personally became interested in the idea that documentation needs to be decolonized. I've worked in museums for 10 years and I have a museum studies MA, but I don't have a PhD, and I consider myself to be a generalist. As I've worked in this field, I've realized how poor the state of documentation is in many collections. And I've always advocated for the importance of doing the inventories and documenting everything in order to make collections more accessible. However, in doing so, I've witnessed some of the ways that documentation practice has been problematic and harmful, as well as useful. And I'm sure many of you who've worked with historic documentation have the experience of coming across offensive words or phrases in catalogue descriptions, and perhaps that's why you're here today. I still think we need to better document our collections in order to manage them, but I think it is useful to consider how the act of documentation might be categorized as colonial before we start to think about how we might decolonize it. So some of the things we might discuss this afternoon include the basis of documentation practice in the European Enlightenment desire to know, collect, and demonstrate mastery over other cultures. Museums and the culture of collecting as we know it grew up in tandem with European colonialism. And with global expansion and exploration comes the desire to name and claim natural specimens, peoples, and places. And museums and art collections have acted as the storehouses of this colonial project. how the whiteness of today's curatorial and collections workforce can perpetuate a colonial power dynamic, where the former colonizer assumes the authority and expertise to best describe the material culture and art of the formerly colonized. And today we can think about how that can be disrupted, and how core documentation practice can respond to interpretations of collections outside of this dynamic, both from people who have not previously been considered experts within the museum, and ways of knowing which use embodiment and emotion to understand objects. So we'll kickstart the workshop with two presentations that should help get us thinking about some of these issues and challenges at hand and possible strategies to deal with them. We will be hearing from museums documentation researcher Ananda Rutherford about the historic basis for contemporary problems in cataloguing, and Marenka Thompson Odlum about some of the issues that have surfaced during her work on the Labelling Matters project at the Pitt Rivers Museum. We will then take a short comfort break and then go straight back into our breakout groups, where we will each be discussing an example of a challenge that we are grappling with or an approach which we have trialed for better or worse. And through our conversations, trying to come up with other tools, approaches, and initiatives that we can realistically test out back in our respective workplaces. The breakout session will last about an hour, and we will then all come back together to hear what the groups have been talking about. You should have been told already by email, but just to remind you that this workshop is being recorded. The recordings will not be published. However, they will be held securely by the Contemporary Arts Society and only used for anonymised transcriptions, which will provide the basis for a report on the workshop that you will all have access to. So in cataloguing tradition, we'll be moving from the general to the specific, and we'll start with Ananda Rutherford's presentation on documenting collections. Thank you, Ananda.
Hi, thanks Kathleen, and thanks Caroline. Let's see if I can actually make this work. Are we there? Okay, so I've ended up talking a bit less about the sort of historical roots and more about thinking about what we can practically do. And I don't have a very pithy title, but as Kathleen said, I'm a collections and documentation manager, but I ducked out of the museum world to try and address my discomfort with collections documentation and online collections, especially through research. Both are problematic and not very good at capturing the vagaries and vicissitudes of knowledge, let alone ethical nuance. And today we are essentially talking about knowledge production and management and how to do it better. The following quotation from Safia Noble gets to the heart of the matter. I hope some of you, I think you were sent the link by Cass, and I hope that you've had a chance to look into her work, because she's pretty marvellous. So she says, knowledge management reflects the same social biases that exist in society because human beings are at the epicenter of information curation. These practices of the past are part of the present, and only committed and protracted investments in repairing knowledge stores to reflect and recenter all communities can cause a shift towards equality and inclusion in the future. This includes reconciling our brutal past rather than obscuring or minimizing it. And in this way, we have yet to fully confront our histories and reconstitute libraries and museums towards reconciliation and reparation. My question today is, what approaches can be employed to engage critically and ethically with museum documentation to tackle structural bias and the hegemony of traditional Western, colonial and heteronormative ableist norms of knowledge production and practice? I don't have definitive answers. What I do have in this session is a lot more questions for you. My hope is that if we start from a position of understanding better how we work the way we do, what the issues are and how they manifest in our records, where the information ends up and what effect it has, we can move towards a better anti-racist and critically reflective practice, recognising how we got here and that our traditional practices are part of the problem. So what does decolonisation of documentation actually mean in practice? I get asked a lot, how do you decolonise a database? The really short answer is that you can't. The other short answer is, I think this is the wrong question. I think it's worth unpicking what we're actually asking here and why. Who is this work for and who does it benefit? What is the work of decolonising this context? Is it data cleaning? Is it reputation saving? Is it brand management, erasure, inventory, audit, cataloguing, updates, or assuaging conscience? Do you want a quick fix now because of the current climate or a trend, or do you want to make sustainable and embedded change? A better question might be, how do we work towards a critically engaged, ethical and anti-racist way of working? So I think this is also going to be groups of 3 and everything, which is a habit of mine. So we've got 3 starting points for thinking about this, and I'm hoping this will help people kind of structure their approaches. Firstly, we need to name and own the problem. Secondly, we need to consider how and why we are where we are in UK glam and academia. And lastly, we need to properly understand documentation and cataloguing, how it works and what we do. Basically, we have to take a few steps back to try and understand what's going on before we plough ahead and make everything better. So naming the problem. The problem in the world is white supremacy, colonialism, racism. The problem is on the internet. It's the digital cultural record repeating socio-political ideas and issues. The problem is for us in museums, glam, cultural heritage, memory institutions, the art world, whatever you want to call us. The problem is us, a majority white museum sector. The problem is what we do, who and what we include, and who and what we exclude. The we is in inverted commas because I think it's a shifting we. The problem is the words we use to name the problem: diversity, inclusion, engagement, decolonisation, rendered increasingly meaningless from overuse and misappropriation and misunderstanding. So how did we get here? We tend to proceed within a set of myths that are taken as immutable truths. And this is a trick of colonialism and racism. The myths of race as supported by science, and obviously this is not to deny racism, but that it hasn't no scientific basis, and classification of humans by skin colour are spurious. The myth of neutrality and objectivity, which I think in museums we still hang on to despite sort of 40 years of the new museology. The myth of classification and categorization being fixed or sensible or even making sense. The myth of value, the myth of nice white people. All of these things can be challenged and changed. And thirdly, there are the specifics of documentation and cataloguing. What is it? How do we do it? What is it for? What is the point of it? Is it knowledge production, information capture, or collections management, or all of these things? Are our standards and guidance fit for purpose? Do the tools we have and use help or hinder? Do our methods and practices shape ways of knowing and limit them or expand them? So it's another 3 here. So how do we describe these issues? How these issues are manifest in our work, and what are the solutions? Issues around documenting and cataloguing work, for me, tend to fall into 3 main categories. There's language, the words we use and how we write. There's subject and content, what and who we choose to write about. And practice and systems, the way we organise and frame things, categorisation, classification, and of course, structured data, and the remediation of all of those between analogue and digital. Language, to start off with, is the most often articulated and easily recognised issue, and it's usually described as offensive, inappropriate, abusive and harmful words. And people get hung up on words, rightly so, in many of these cases. But understanding language is much broader than that is important. In some ways, I think this is one of the most straightforward issues to address, but it is shockingly, casually still prevalent in records and documentation and online. There is more to addressing language, so I'm going to suggest some more things to think about here. Again, there's tone, pseudo-objectivity, which we talked about earlier, performative neutrality from a position of authority and therefore of control and power. Tone policing. What do you edit out and clean up to sound proper, formal or professional, to meet the expectations of the previous point about tone? There are veiled slurs and cliches, disguised racisms, ignorance, insensitivities, objectification and dehumanization, and erasure. There are controlled vocabularies, but who gets to define them? Who applies them? Who gets to impose that order? There's also something that we neglect, such as naming conventions, spellings, transliterations and preferred terms. There's also ignoring racialized and minoritized language and language difference. Colloquialisms and change and fluidity in semantics. Classification exists in linguistics too, and there isn't, believe it or not, and I didn't know this, a distinction between dialect and language. It's actually, you know, so people that argue what is and what isn't valid, it's debatable. There's also understanding, fundamentally, the social, geographical and temporal situatedness of language and how to represent and address that in our records. There's also subject and content. Sometimes more difficult to unpack is the subject and the subject matter, but what you choose to work on and find out about generates more information and new knowledge. It makes artifacts more visible, people, artists, makers, and histories better known. It makes things easier to find. It also confers value, museum value, intellectual worth, financial value, and cultural capital. You need to consider a few questions. I'm not going to read all of them, but I do have a lot. You know, who and what is chosen as representative of your institution or a movement, or an idea or a cultural moment? Who and what is not chosen to document, to catalogue, to digitise, to exhibit and promote? Which works, and I think this is a crucial one, have time, money and resources invested in them, and why? Which works languish and are ignored? Who is published? Who do you cite? Who do you allocate as authoritative or definitive or expert, or the expert voice, and why? Who or what is instrumentalized to connect with racialized and marginalized communities? Which artifacts or people are considered difficult or hard to reach, was the phrase people used about audiences? Why and by whom? Where is research missing? Where is knowledge missing? And where is there too much research focus? And I think we can all name the people that get named over and over again ad nauseum in our collections. Lastly, and this is complicated to get into in brief, but there are systems, structures and practices. Here I mean both the paper and digital systems and data structures of documentation, cataloguing and research, and the infrastructure of the organisations. So which data and information are privileged and used most, and why? How do you deal with systems of meaning, ontologies and epistemologies that do not fit the traditional Western Eurocentric norms of understanding the world? What tools and standards and guidance do you use, say Spectrum or AAT, whatever it is, and are they fit for purpose? Do you approach them critically, or do they replicate racist and colonial practices? What does your local data manual or your cataloguing guide say? What examples does it give? Is it fit for purpose, or does it replicate racist and colonial practices? Do you know who does what and who did what within your institution? Who signs off, edits, corrects? What's their agenda in all of this? When do you change or query things? What do you file and what do you digitize? What do you allow access to and what do you restrict? How does this affect the way in which the narrative around the object, the collection and the museum is constructed? So I was really trying to think about practical things because I think this is what people want answers to a lot of the time. So, we've got 4 here, not 3, that's a boon. We've got identify, assess and audit, and this is the manager in me. So all those who feel creative in any way, this is a project management guide. Use your audit data to advocate and inform policy and practice. Understand context, past and future, and read. So identifying, assess and audit is about finding evidence. We talk in general terms and people will have examples today. But if you know your collection, you can do this. You can audit as well against anything. You can add a question to your location audit, and you can even not leave your desk because you're auditing data. What works and artifacts have thin to no records is one of my key questions beyond the inventory record. Which artists do you have little biographical information on, and which records have no object history? Which works don't fit the current agenda of your institution? Which records contain, and this is an obvious one, explicit or veiled racist language or lack preferred terms in people, place or material? Which objects have colonial connections and contexts? Which records focus on donors and patrons rather than artists and communities of origin? So you can use this information and use the numbers. If information is power, you can demonstrate the issues and inform policy and practice and advocate for change. I'm going to leave that because I'm probably going on. So the last one is understanding context, past and future. And I think this is really crucial because we accept that we are where we are very often without understanding that there were many previous agendas in play for your organisation. Political funding bodies, individuals, you know, things are going on. They have their political moments in the past that inform how collections is shaped and how they're presented. So do you know the institutional history of your collection and organisation? How is it set up? How has its remit and agenda changed? Where does the power lie? Who were the key actors? And can you find this and demonstrate it in your documentation? Can you trace this history in your cataloguing work? So I think where you sit in all of this is really important too. Why are you working? What gives you the authority? What do you think you know? What do you need to know? Do you author your contributions? Do you admit ignorance? And lastly, read. Situate yourself and your work. Think about positionality. Where do you sit with all of these within all of these debates? What do you believe? How do you understand racism? How do you understand other people's experience of racism, prejudice, and inequity? And what are you going to do about it within the sphere of your work? Where does your institution sit? What does it do? What racism does it enact? Think about the history. The last ones are think about the historical method and historiography, how we write history, and think about how to apply your reading and thinking to your work. To end with, I've got two slightly mega quotes. The first one is from Veli Mitova in a paper she gave in 2020, talking about how colonial knowledge works, which I really love. Although there are some words in there that I had to look up, and I will give the meanings of them if anybody wants them. I'll put them in the chat, because arrogated was a new one on me. But they're worth there. I'm not going to read them out. And the other one is from Heidi Geismar, who's an anthropologist at UCL and works on material culture and digital anthropology. And her book, Museum Object Lessons for the Digital Age, is a really good read. And that's all for me. I hope that was useful.
Thank you, Ananda. I think Ananda's summarised a lot of information very well there that speaks to the systemic problems that we're dealing with collections documentation. But it's also worth remembering that some of those systems are localised within our own museums and teams, and we do have the power to change those. So we'll be moving straight on to the next presentation. We will have time for questions for both of our speakers afterwards. So I'd like to now introduce Marenka, Thompson, Odlum.
Thanks, Kathleen. Hi, everyone. I'm try and share my screen and get started. All right, here we go. So hi, everyone. I'm Marenka. I work at the Pitt Rivers Museum as a research associate, specifically on the Labeling Matters project. And I think kind of the Labeling Matters project was first kind of seen as a move towards decolonizing the Pitt Rivers, if that's possible, which we can get into later. But I think before even kind of embedding decolonial practice, you kind of have to realize all the ways that coloniality exists within your institution. And so I think that's like one of the first things we had to reckon with this project. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So just to give you an idea, the Pitt Rivers Museum, if you don't know, is a museum of anthropology and archaeology. It was founded in 1884, and you can see here is a map of where our largest areas of collecting, where the material is coming from. We have 500,000 objects, photographs, manuscripts, and sound archives in our collection. And what you can see here is the larger the circles, the greater the collection from that geographical area, and the lighter areas are the former British Empire. And as you can see, it maps on pretty well with where our areas of collecting are. So you get to really see that this museum is really set up in a very specific colonial context. That being, you know, a lot of the early curators basically used colonial networks to travel to acquire objects. A lot of colonial officers who were educated by the University of Oxford and the Pitt Rivers Museum, because it was a specific course set up for colonial officers. Basically, they said, before we send you off to your position somewhere in the continent of Africa, usually, you should come to the Pitt Rivers to get a diploma in anthropology to learn about the place that you're going to. Again, so many issues. So again, very specific colonial context with the Pitt Rivers Museum. But that context is not only about where the areas of the geographical distribution of our collection, but also the language we use and was used, still being used, and how it kind of upholds those colonial ideologies. So on one side, we have some of these older labels from the Pitt Rivers Museum. They're no longer on display, but they were only taken off display in the early 2000s. So when you think in the grand scheme of things, not that long ago. And you can see some of them have very kind of offensive, racist, derogatory language, primitive dwellings, modern savage, also using colonial toponyms or place names. So you have British Burma, Rhodesia, Nigeria and the British Cameroons. Yeah, so a lot going on in this image. But then you also have, and these aren't on display, but we still have some that are on display. So you will see the term savage in some of the labels. You'll see the term blackfellows used to describe Aboriginal Australian people in some places, and just, yes, a plethora of other words as well. But then on the other side, you have language that is much more euphemistic, meaning that it seemingly doesn't seem offensive, but when you kind of start breaking it down, you realize that, you know, it's basically promoting a specific kind of narrative and knowledge. And so this is from the Court Art of Benin case, and the case label, as you can see, reads in January 1897, a small party of British officials and trainers on its way to Benin was ambushed. In retaliation, a British military force attacked the city. The Oba was exiled. Members of the expedition brought thousands of objects back to Britain, including many of those shown here. All right, so so many things wrong with this label. You know, the emphasis on the idea of a small party of British officials and traders. First thing, British officials and traders are not benign agents, they're colonial agents. So we need to think about that. Again, ambushed, it doesn't tell the actual story that they were specifically told not to enter Benin City at that time, but that's not in there. And of course, in retaliation, so it's almost like this is something you had to do. And it doesn't say that the British military force was like 1,000 or strong. So it really kind of doesn't give you the entire picture, nor does it use like terms like loot or plunder, because this is a military expedition. It doesn't even use the term punitive expedition of 1897, which was the term used at the time. And like, I mean, it's just very telling, because when you look at this case in the museum, one of the objects is this very large carved ivory tusk, and you can still see the scorch marks from where the city was burnt down, explosives we've used. We also have a manuscript from a member of the British Army that attacked the Benin City, and we basically break down all the different kinds of weapons and explosives that were used in different areas of Benin City. But yet, none of that is, you know, seen in this label. And then again, you know, labels don't always stay the same, although you'll be surprised. For sometimes we think when we write a label that it's permanent, which is ridiculous, you know. But labels do change within the Pitt Rivers over time. However, they still kind of uphold very similar ideas. So here, you can see the image of case 149A, yes. And it's now called Human Form in Art, which that case heading was put in 2002. But when the museum first started in the 1880s, it was the collections within those cases were called Human Form in Savage Art, Human Form in Barbaric Art, then it was Human Form in Civilized and Barbaric Art, and then it got used to development and degradation, and then Human Form in Tribal and Folk Art, and finally we got to just Human Form in Art. And what that just goes to show is that, yes, we now call Human Form in Art, but the division of those objects still exists, because all the ones that were termed quote unquote savage art are still in the same case, 149A. But then if you look in case 148A, then all the objects that were termed from civilized cultural groups are still in that case, which you can see some of them below. So here you have an ancient Egyptian statue, you have some that's European, and then you have Roman Empire as well. So again, that kind of archaeological canon of what civilization is. And so then when you look within our database, the term savage or barbaric comes up a lot when you're looking at the objects in the first picture in case 149A, because that is part of their display history. And so yeah, and then you have terms on the labels like fetish or grotesque. So again, even though the case heading has changed to kind of make this more kind of uniform or like quote unquote democratic, that's like the word they like to use in the museum display, in actuality, a lot of the language is still upholding these ideas. Sorry, I have to go very quickly because I just realized I wanted to say a lot in 10 minutes. And so my question was then like, how do you then go about, thinking through all these labels and terminologies and, just your displays? Because in some cases it's really easy. You see a word and you're like, ooh, that is not that is an offensive term. But then, you have ones, for example, like the Benin case one, where it is technically factual, maybe, but again, it's much harder to spot the issues, especially if you're not aware of the context and the history behind it. And so I just basically did this, going through all the cases, which were so many cases, using Criano's colonial matrix of power, which basically just says like coloniality broadly happens in three systems: hierarchies, knowledge, and culture. And so then what I did was I literally went around to each case and every label and asked, does this label or display, and I also use this with like all my daily decisions as well, does this establish hierarchies? So just hierarchies meaning, for basically colonization to exist, false hierarchies had to be created. And so these are usually along, quote unquote, what they term racial lines. Could also be gender, but it's also labor, although you find those things often intersect as well. Then I also asked myself, does this label or display assign power to or the privilege of the production of Eurocentric knowledge? Often does, because there are often labels, text, English, often don't even use the terms from the cultural groups where those objects were collected. And does this impose a kind of white Eurocentric culture? And for example, this is one label. The label is the one in the middle that says opium is a legal narcotic, and it's from the opium case, which, well, the whole range of cases called smoking and stimulants. Interestingly enough, a few years ago, it was called the narcotics case. Glad that changed. But, the first thing it says is opium is an illegal narcotic, which is such a value-laden statement to begin with. But also, I didn't realize that like legality was universal. Because apparently it is, because they've said it that it's a legal narcotic everywhere. It also just doesn't really take into account the very long and varied history of opium use. Even they use the term Papaver somniferum, the scientific binomial name, which I think is really interesting because we use it because we think of it as universal, but it's only universal because of colonization. So it's just, it's really interesting. It's like, why don't we use different terms for this plant? Because I didn't know what Papaver somniferum meant. Also, it basically focuses on China. It mentions it twice within this. So really much like narrowing down the focus of the narrative, and also just kind of upholding stereotypes. Yet it doesn't mention the opium wars at all, even though all the objects within that case were collected basically during the British sanctioned opium trade. So from 1860 to like the early 1900s, that's not mentioned at all. And it says a thriving trade. Now, when I hear the term thriving, it usually implies like something positive or like prosperity, but which it was a huge source of revenue for the colonial government, yet it was devastating to many communities and countries. So not only as they imply in this China, but when I really started looking at the different narratives, you have the narratives coming out of how it affected cultural groups in India, Aboriginal Australian people. It talks about like Singapore, Malaysia, like all these things, and also kind of the legacy that still exists today of that time period as well. But none of that is spoken about. So the question is like, while a lot of this is, like, as I said, not incorrect, what knowledge are we, what knowledge are we producing, and what kind of hierarchies are we still perpetuating within this? Next. So, sorry, yes, I'm just gonna play this while I talk. It is a skinning the fish, so if you don't like it, you might want to turn off for a second. So this slide is just kind of asking myself, how then can we, think through labeling and, other forms of kind of knowledge. And this, so on one side, you can see the salmon shoes on display, salmon skin shoes on display in the Pitt Rivers Museum, made by the Ainu, who are indigenous people of Japan. And, I walk past this every day, didn't really, connect with me until I started working with Aiko Soga, she's a Japanese artist. She's actually doing her DPhil at the Ruskin School of Art. But she also mixes it with a lot of field work. So she spends a lot of time in Hokkaido with the Ainu. And here is, you can see her, sorry, this is just clips of her video art piece, so it's not the whole thing, but she's actually gonna make what a salmon skin shoes, and she's being instructed by Kane-san, who's 79 years old, Ainu woman, and she's fantastic. And watching this really kind of brought it to life for me, because one of the reasons is when I watch the whole thing, there's this one fly that keeps on buzzing around the video while she's skinning the fish. And this put me, I'm from the Caribbean, so basically I just remember going to fish markets and flies and fish, they're always buzzing around, and really put me in that space with Aiko, as kind of, I can imagine the smell. It was way more sensory, but also Aiko practices what she calls felt knowledge, or it could be embodied knowledge. It was almost kind of the antithesis of this idea of rational, universal, that abstract curatorial third-person voice on a text. And so I really kind of like that, because it was a very different way of documenting these salmon skin shoes. But also what I enjoyed about Aiko's work is that she types, as you can see the types on, she types on top, but she keeps on backspacing because she finds herself using words. So there's a time when she uses the words she says the Ainu are suspicious people, but then she erases that almost immediately because she realizes that term, is again othering, which happens a lot, especially with a lot of communities, especially indigenous communities as well. And so she continuously kind of rethinks her thought process and questions herself the same way I talked about those 3 questions I keep on asking myself. But she also uses this as a form of, activism for the idea of fishing rights amongst the Ainu, because they've not been allowed to commercially fish in the rivers of Hokkaido since the late 19th century, which then means that a lot of times they can't practice the art of making salmon skin shoes or salmon skin coats, because if not, you have to go to a supermarket to buy a whole salmon to get the whole skin, which then can be very expensive when you have to have 60 salmon to make a salmon coat. So all these kind of ideas. And so actually I'm talking to Aiko about acquiring this piece in the museum to use as this kind of different form of labeling. And one more thing really quickly, I just realized I've gone on too long. And finally, one of the other things I've been currently working on is that I kind of used what came out of the survey and review of the language of the Pitt Rivers that I've done to kind of inform some new collecting. And one of those specific things is I commissioned a series of 16 paintings from a Hawaiian artist called Solomon Enos. And basically I left it all up to him. I was like, what would you like to create for us? What would you like to see in the museum? How would you like to be represented? And so he started talking about this tale of Hiakai Kapoliopele. Yes, I got it right. And, or the tale of Hiaka for short, which is this epic mythological tale. But he focuses specifically on this one point in the story where Hiaka goes underground, subterranean, and she meets these kind of insect hybrid people who they change from insects to humans. The whole idea kind of being, the whole kind of circle of life. You die, you return to the ground, insects. And he really wanted to focus on that narrative, but also wanted to bring in pieces from the Hawaiian collection within the Pit Rivers and kind of activate them within his characters. So here you see a kapa maker. So she has the kapa beater. She's actually wearing the kapa cloth, which is a bark cloth, I should say. And you can see the same design on her skirt, on the skirt, as you can see on the kapa object within the museum and the cords. And what's really great about this is because while I was kind of looking at the language used around the Hawaiian collections, many things came to like mind. One, every time, and it's specific because we have a cook case, there's also, as in Captain Cook case, which is not just Hawaiian, but objects, but actually greater Polynesian objects. And one of the things I was seeing, every time we talked about Polynesian objects, they were usually centered around a European figure or kind of a European, like, quote unquote, contact. Also, there was just like big like misunderstanding of kind of Hawaiian cosmology, but also like epistemology. They didn't really get how Polynesians kind of situated themselves within the world. So for example, in the Cook case, all the labeling talks about the voyagers being Cook and his entourage, and the islanders being the people from kind of Oceania. And I was just like, but yeah, islanders, voyagers, that makes no sense. Specifically when you think about, like the vast area and kind of polyculturalness and the movement within that by Polynesian peoples. And then also all the narratives focused on basically men and no women within this. And so Salman kind of really thought about this and how he'd like to present this. And so this image there, it's still a draft, but he has a series of 16 characters. They're all different endemic insect species to Hawaii. So also talking about the fact that, Hawaii has seen really like bad extinction and extinction rates of a lot of the flora and fauna. So really wanted to highlight that as well. But also the fact that each of these characters have their own role to play within society. And like Saul wrote like a great like narrative for one of them, which is the hula dancer. And he said like the hula dancer is just as important as the kapa maker or the kalo farmer, because the fabric of reality also needs upkeep. And so I thought that was like so beautiful how he said that, but also the fact that like this entire series of paintings is focused around a tale and not at all around any kind of European figure. And kind of, yeah, that was really important to me. But also what was more important was the fact that just the whole process of commissioning this work is that I saw that through of like writing contracts and, any like conservation needs and queries. That was actually really hard because the whole system was created to hinder you from actually working a decolonial manner, as in you weren't really allowed to change the contract to say that that the museum didn't own all copyrights or licensing rights and all those things. It wasn't, the acquisitions process wasn't set up to say, actually, like this needs to be displayed or cared for in a specific way, which was great because it also now gives me an avenue in which to start reworking and rewriting those things, which is fun and difficult, but I'm trying, and I'm going to stop there because I'm already over time. So, thank you.
Thank you, Marenka. I think both of those presentations were really interesting, and something that came from them is the idea that we do tend to focus on language. And as Marenka showed with the Pit Rivers labels and cases, the language can change, but the divisions and the way things are organized has remained. So we do have some time for questions. And if anyone has any questions for either of the speakers, please put them in the chat. And while you're formulating your questions, I would just like to ask both of you, whether we call it the catalogue or the database or the record, is it possible to reimagine a decolonized database, and what if in a you know, it's been said that actually you can't imagine a world without empire because our world has been shaped by European empires. But if we do a little thought experiment, what could you imagine that decolonized catalogue to be?
I think about this a lot, but and I could really get into databases at enormous and boring length and their limitations, and also the promise of the digital that is eternally for my entire career going to solve this problem. But I actually think we're getting a little bit nearer, and I do think things like I think that search is more powerful, we can interrogate more, and that we can be less hung up on our databases. And I think if we move forward to look at actually what we do and separate some of the, what I'd call the sort of management issues, although they're all colonially inflected, as Marenka's just pointed out, in the where the barriers sit in terms of acquisition policy. I mean, it all needs unpicking. But actually, I think that in terms of the knowledge and object histories, I think we're getting to the point where these can be retrievable in nuanced and complex ways by just producing more information. So for me, a lot of the problem has been things are just not catalogued. And I used to think that wasn't the problem, it was the structure. But actually, until you put the knowledge out there, until you record information in any form, in film, in whatever, and we're now getting to the point where we can actually pull up the content of audio and video along with the paper records, that we get a richer, multivocal, you know, pluralistic, global, international, nuanced, historical, with contestation and argumentation, and I do now finally think that. But in the tools we have at the moment, I think our job is to get the information out there, to preserve what was done, to understand it, but to keep researching the bits that are neglected, and to keep surfacing them, because they're not findable unless you've written something about them or named them. And as much as possible, that has to be outside of colonial structured data, but we can do our best within the structures that exist. And that's what I'm kind of advocating for. I'm sort of got a solution for the next 5 to 10 years until the miracle happens. But that miracle's been going to happen digitally for, you know, the eons of my lifetime.
Thank you. Marenka, do you have anything to add on an imagined decolonized database?
Ugh, sometimes I don't let myself think that far ahead. But I think just thinking of, I mean, what we could possibly do now is, well, a lot of it to me is just giving up control. Even within that database structure that we have, which is very hierarchical and has all these issues, it's, you know, literally about giving up control. And because I've seen some examples where we say, okay, yes, we will let, you know, the makers and practitioners and different, like, actually put input into the database. Yet I have seen this happen. It's like that information comes to us and then somebody at the museum goes in and corrects it. And I'm just like, how? First of all, you know nothing about, like, even just like correcting, like, just language use and things like that. So I was like, but maybe that's how they wanted to express themselves, you know? It's just very interesting. It's like all these things that we kind of lauded ourselves for, but then you turn right around and run, like, and in putting it into the database, then you're actually taking back control. So yeah, I think almost a space where that kind of middle person is cut out. I'm not saying people should lose their jobs, because every time I say give up control, everyone will be like, well, then what is the role? I was like, well, you have to reimagine your role. It's not that there might not be a space for you, you just have to rethink what it is about. And so, yeah, I think that is, like, that's my top thing, is always, in whatever you do, even within the structures that we have now, if you start giving up that control, then I think you'll see, like, at least incremental changes happening. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that it really speaks to the fact that I think both of you alluded to, that within cataloguing, we still think of this kind of neutral, objective voice. And that becomes obvious when someone else comes in who has a different way of describing something, perhaps a different dialect, or there's linguistic differences that aren't the typical kind of detached museum speak. that becomes obvious. But of course, we all have our own viewpoints and biases which we bring to our cataloguing. And I don't think we've got any questions in the chat, so I'm just going to keep talking to you both about this because I think it's a great opportunity to get into it.
No, sorry, there is a question.
Oh, you do. Thank you.
No, it must be difficult for you because you're also moderating, but I see one here from Ellen Record.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so it's a question for Marenka from Helen Record, thank you. The photograph of historic labels for cases was pretty shocking, and it's important that the Pitt Rivers Museum has documented that they were previously used and deemed acceptable. When you go through the cases, to what extent do you keep a record of the inappropriate labels or terms when you change them? And how do you document this information so that we can learn from these former uses of language in the future?
Excellent question, Helen. Because those that I showed you have no idea where half of them came from, because I found them in a box in the collections office when I started 2 years ago. And that's just, and when I say it's one of these big, plastic bins, and that was one of about 10. And so, yeah, I've been trying to piece together a little about where they came from. Some of them you can tell because some of them are object ones, so they still have accession numbers, so you can look into the database for that. But then the ones that just say things like modern savage, no clue where that came from. Although I can kind of try to make guesses based on, the term modern savage, as it comes up mostly in the human form in art case when you look through the database. But yeah, so that is something that I've been trying to do now with the ones that have been taken off since I started, is basically, I think it was really hard because some of the language I just literally didn't want to see, but I also knew it was really important to document it, which means, again, it had to go into the database in like at least what we call the primary documentation field, where we have like pre Pitt Rivers Museum label, then like all the different label changes after that. And so that's where that is kind of documented. But what I've started trying to do is now saying also why it was taken off display, because it's surprising, like some words that I think are really offensive, a lot of people don't know. So, yeah, it was very kind of, so I've been trying to do that to say, hey, this is, and I mean, just like 1 or 2 lines, because we don't have like the power, the resources to go through every single one and give a huge document over the case, which I would love to. But
Thank
yeah,
you.
so
sorry to cut you off, but we are kind of run out.
Oh, no problem.
But yeah, I think that the point about terms that people don't know is a very good one, because often they are these archaic terms that you wouldn't see in everyday use now, not because they're offensive, because they've fallen out of use. And they're the ones that crop up. And Abir in the chat has made a good comment that we need to consider the emotional labour involved in this for people doing the cataloguing. And then, you're sort of taking on that, you're acting as a barrier to prevent people in the public seeing these offensive terms. You've sort of got to kind of diffuse it almost. Very quickly before we go on to our break, Ananda, I know that you're an advocate for preserving terms and recording what's been done. Would you like to just quickly explain why you think it's important?
Yeah, I just wanted to, well, I mean, partly there's if you disappear the language from the databases, you can never search for those things again. And they are historical production, and we need to be able to identify, if you want to talk about these things in the past and how, that's important to preserve. But I also think there needs to be a shift in attitude towards documentation, that it is not an adjunct. These are actually items, be it digital or analog, that are human cultural production in themselves. And if you start thinking about it that way, and we could go on, forever, metadata, but I do think that it's incredibly important to, at least going forward, if you can't do it retrospectively, to be transparent about your actions in your projects. And most people's databases unbeknownst to them, can cope with this kind of thing. You can allocate project, you can allocate people, you can allocate authors and activities. And also, I think, just speaking to Marenka's point about control, that a lot of us have got authority control and can show related terms, preferred terms, old terms, historic terms, and there are systems for doing that. And I think we need to just, you know, mobilize the powers we do have to be more transparent. So I think the tools are there, and yeah, that's all really. Sorry.
Thank you. Okay, so we do now have a 10-minute comfort break before our breakout sessions. So you can obviously turn off your screen, turn off video and mute if you need to go and take a break, and you will automatically be put into your breakout rooms when we return in 10 minutes. So I look forward to speaking to my group shortly. Thank you.